How important has this week been, do you think, for Israel?
I think it's an important week for both Israel and for Palestine, and I hope that it is, as you described, a turning point, a shift in this war, because it's on Sunday, actually, we're going to be marking 6 months since it began. No one could have imagined that it would have taken so long and that so many people would have been killed in Gaza and in Israel. We're two traumatized societies, and we really need the help of the international community to find a diplomatic way to end this war, because there is no military solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Well, there's never really a military solution to these conflicts, as we know from Northern Ireland, for instance.
That's for sure.
Okay, but are we closer to a political solution, do you think, then?
I think we're still a bit away. But I think that we have seen some restraint now on Israel in not implementing its plan to attack the city of Rafah in the last 20% of the Gaza Strip in the south that hasn't been attacked yet by Israel. There is now a major push of the international community, a very nasty phone call between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu on the whole humanitarian aid issue after the 7 aid workers were killed. And it seems that the talk of flooding the Gaza Strip with humanitarian aid may actually begin to happen, which is a desperately needed relief for the civilian population there, who's been suffering so badly since the beginning of this war.
But that aid can only be, distributed to the people who really need it if there's also a ceasefire. If you still have Israeli soldiers or drones, killing Palestinians, then the same mistakes might be made yet again, and that aid won't get to the people who need it.
Well, that's for sure. The best situation would be if we can have a ceasefire, but there's not going to be a ceasefire unless there's a deal also to release the 134 Israeli hostages who are still being held by Hamas, including infants and women and elderly people. So, there's a humanitarian cause on both sides. Sure. One of the reasons of Israeli resistance to provide more humanitarian aid is saying that the Israeli hostages are in the tunnels and the bunkers underneath the ground with Hamas fighters pointing guns at them, and they're not receiving humanitarian aid.
Indeed. And you've negotiated hostage releases in the past. You know how the Qataris roll on this and operate on this front, and indeed Hamas. What do you think is preventing Hamas from doing what, to me, as someone very much on the outside of all this, would seem like the next logical gesture, which is to release the hostages? Maybe if not all of them, at least a large bulk of them, to say, this is what this is our moral high ground. Here are the hostages. Arguably they should have done that a very long time ago. But why do you think they're not doing it?
Well, from the inside story, I can tell you that both sides believe that the other side is not serious in these negotiations. This is the claim on both sides. The Israelis are claiming that Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas in Gaza, is holding on to the hostages because that's his only life insurance policy. He's surrounded by the hostages and keeping them in hiding underground. And Hamas claims that Israel is not interested in a ceasefire or a hostage deal because Netanyahu is only interested in prolonging the war to prolong his own political career, because everyone knows that when this war is over, he's going to have his day of reckoning with the Israeli people. So there seem to be, there's no trust between the parties. They're both committed to killing each other. And these are very difficult negotiations to move forward.
And yet, from Hamas's point of view, and maybe logic doesn't come into it so easily in this sort of very febrile situation, if they were to release, 50 hostages or 80 hostages or 100 hostages today and still keep a few, and you were involved in the negotiations over one single hostage. One single hostage lasted years and led to the release of over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. So why not release a batch of them today, at least to show some goodwill?
Well, that's a very good question. I think you need to try and figure out how you can ask Hamas the question.
But if you ask those questions, then you hit the wall immediately, and it's all about, everyone goes to their maximalist positions, everyone goes back to history. But, in the here and now, that would be the sensible thing to do, surely.
It certainly would be. But look, we're dealing with a conflict that has not made sense for a very long time. It's obvious that there is no winner in this war. Both sides have lost terribly, and the longer the war goes on, both sides are losing more. There is also no win-lose situation because no one's going to surrender. So we're in a lose-lose situation, and it's very difficult to use logic to talk to these people. We need to use pressure. International pressure needs to be applied
on
both sides. Right, the Qataris and the Egyptians have leverage over Hamas. The United States and other allies, the UK, have leverage over Israel, and there needs to be a coalescing of international pressure on both Israel and Hamas to get this war over.
And I guess the Qataris or the Egyptians are reluctant to use their leverage over Hamas because they, until now, have not seen the Americans using their leverage over Tel Aviv.
That's certainly part of it. The Qataris began, but the Qataris are also very angry with Israel right now because Netanyahu has been attacking the Qataris in public, and that's not something you do when you want them to be effective negotiators. There's also a big fight going on between Biden and Netanyahu now, which is maybe the good thing that needs to happen. But Netanyahu is standing firm because he knows that he is facing the end of his political career. And it seems that Netanyahu has already voiced between the lines his support for Donald Trump, which is certainly not going to help Israel with the Americans right now.
Indeed. And actually, Donald Trump has been surprisingly critical of Bibi Netanyahu. I mean, I remember talking to one of his people after October the 7th, and I kind of half expected him to show up at the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. And they said, no, he won't turn up because Netanyahu congratulated Joe Biden on his victory in 2020, as you would, right? Trump has never forgiven him for that, which is...
That's right. He even cursed him.
I know. It's extraordinary. But that's another matter, and that's Trump for you. So, so just a couple of other questions, if I may. Do you think that, is anyone in this sort of relatively brief and very fragile pause, not so much in the fighting, but for thought at the moment, is anyone thinking truly about what some kind of final settlement for the Palestinian people in Gaza would look like?
I know that there are people who are talking about it. They're not people perhaps in government today and people who have positions of power, but there's a whole group of Palestinians, particularly in the opposition to the current regimes, both Hamas regime and a regime of Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah, who are thinking and talking to each other about possible solutions. I know that there are Israeli civil society organizations and think tanks that have already put out some very well thought out papers. And there's beginning to be a little bit of cross-boundary Israeli-Palestinian dialogue with some of the other Arab neighbors in the region who are sitting and thinking together. And this is what really needs to happen. You need to have a regional solution here, and we need to get partners in the region to work together to think of how we're going to change the regimes in both Israel and Palestine and move us out of this ridiculous conflict toward making the two-state solution real. And here I'll just comment that it's time for the United Kingdom to recognize the state of Palestine in order to help make that two-state solution real.
So you would call on the government here in London to do that today? You have already?
I have.
They won't do it until they get the green light from Washington.
I'm not sure. The UK could really take the first step here and lead the rest of the OECD nations in doing it, including the United States. I don't think the UK has to wait for the United States here. The UK has historic responsibility in the land of Israel and of Palestine. Remember the British Mandate. And I think that historic responsibility is important. I also think that the government in the UK right now, which is probably not going to be the government after the next elections, could use this as a legacy issue. This is something that the Conservative Party can bring to fruition and help to push the two-state solution over the finish line.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because it's no longer that cliche. It's the economy stupid. It's the politics stupid, especially domestic politics. We know that Joe Biden could lose the presidential election because Arab Americans are so upset with his policies. They won't vote for Trump, but they might not vote at all. Splinter candidates would take votes away from him. And as we know, the margins in America are tiny. I mean, tiny.
That's right. But it's not only Arab Americans, it's the young generation in the Democratic Party and the minorities that make up the bulk of the Democratic Party today.
And here we have domestic politics in the form, yet again today, in the Mail on Saturday, of Boris Johnson, former Prime Minister, writing any kind of arms embargo against Israel or just not shipping them arms would send the worst possible signal, and it would spell ultimately the defeat of Israel. And of course, he's appealing to the right-wing core of the Tory party fighting for its survival, although that fight might not end up in success, as the polls would indicate. So it's all tied up with domestic politics as well, isn't it?
It is certainly domestic politics and global politics. Look what happens in the Security Council. We have Russia, China playing against the United States and back and forth, rather than the United Nations Security Council doing what it was created to do, and that's to enforce peace around the world, rather than prolong wars. And that's essentially what's happening in the Security Council.
There's an article, I don't know if you read it, in a magazine or website called Plus 972, that's Israel's international telephone call code. And it's a truly shocking, very detailed piece based on 5 or 6 sources, unidentified sources in the IDF intelligence, about the targeting systems controlled by artificial intelligence used by the IDF to target Hamas operatives. And basically it says, I'm summing it up very crudely here, that for each Hamas operative, and there are about 37,000 military operatives identified, the IDF has allowed 20 to 25 civilian casualties as an acceptable threshold, and for each senior operative, up to 100 operatives. And this, according to this article, and according to the whistleblowers who talked to the Yuval Abraham, the author of the article, explains the extraordinarily high number of civilian casualties. Because although they have to check whether the targets are male or female, and if they're female, they're no longer a target, they have to be male, the only way to make sure that you can kill them is in their homes, to which they return every night. And that's a different AI algorithm. And the homes, of course, is where their wives and their kids are sleeping as well.
Right.
So that's how you get these cultures. Have you read the article? Were you shocked by it?
I've seen the article. I haven't read it in depth yet. The author is generally very credible. I really, really hope that he's off on this one and that what he's writing about is not true, because the thought of what he's writing about is horrific. As a Palestinian, a well-known Palestinian named Ahmed Khatib, who's actually from Gaza, from Khan Yunis, but living in San Francisco, and knows a little bit about AI, he said that these systems are too primitive still and much too awkward to even depend upon them for this kind of horrific idea that you're using artificial intelligence to kill people. So I hope and pray that this article is off base. It may not be, and that's really terrible. If it is true, really something needs to be done at the international level, because if it's happening here, it'll happen in other parts of the world as well. And other large countries with large armies will be using it as well.
Yeah.
And it's a horrible thought.
It's a horrific vision of the future of warfare. And the key thing here is that, AI has been used before to pinpoint targets inside the Gaza Strip before October the 7th. But there was always quite a lot of scrutiny about the targets, an assessment of so-called collateral damage, that ghastly term. But because of the level of the outrage on October the 7th, the level of vengefulness and anger, that level of scrutiny has gone down to something like 20 seconds per target. So the AI keeps producing targets, they keep getting zapped by drones or by military aircraft, and it's just a sort of horrific killing machine.
Yeah, it's really terrible. And that's why we have the huge numbers of casualties in Gaza. And we know that a large number of them, maybe even a majority, are non-combatants, are not engaged, and they're women and children. Really, it's really horrible looking at what's happening there. And this really has to end.
But also, should there not be more scrutiny of this, of the substance of the allegations in this article? This seems to be an absolutely fundamental point.
Definitely, there has to be. And this is, again, thrown back to the international community. No one who uses this kind of killing machine should have impunity.
Okay. Gershon Baskin, you're one of the few optimists left in the region. I hope you're right that this cycle of violence, like previous ones, the 1973 war, the First Intifada, could eventually lead to some kind of dialogue, peace settlement, two-state solution, whatever is out there. But at the moment, I don't know how you feel. I still feel pretty pessimistic that we're going to get there.
Well, it's just in conclusion, we used to say that the Israelis and the Palestinians had to want it more than the rest of the world. That's no longer the case, because this conflict has gone beyond the borders of Israel and Palestine. It affects security in the region. It affects global shipping, which impacts the global economy. And it could lead to a much wider war involving superpowers. So this conflict needs to be brought to an end, and the international community has to walk the walk and not just talk